I told you that there is a pattern in history, and by carefully examining it, we may observe when society is next due to experience a shift and a transformation? What if I told you that we need to unlearn the idea that we are somehow nature-defying, and instead we learn that like the four seasons of winter, spring, summer, and autumn, our society too has regular shifts and patterns? It may be hard to believe that history follows a clear and predictable cycle. I mean, it's been 4 years since the start of the pandemic already, and 5 years ago, who would have predicted that would have been the state of the world today? But it's not in the details, it's in the anticipation of a shift. The world turns in cycle. Each cycle lasts around one lifetime, 80 to 100 years, and is split into 4 seasons known as turnings, where each one is heralded by a deep national shift in mood and culture. The book I'm recapping today is called The Fourth Turning, and it was written in 1997 by the authors who looked towards the world today and suggested we were approaching the fourth turning, a crisis like the ones that many generations before us had experienced. We are in the fourth turning now. As the world breaks out in chaos, it's hard to center ourselves mentally and physically and prepare for things to get worse, but the crisis is just beginning to unfold, and if we want to emerge from it unscathed, with merely a few cuts and bruises, brace ourselves we must. In my new video series, I will be recapping the main points of the book. In The Fourth Turning by Neil Howe and William Strauss, the authors lead us through understanding the confluence of social time and human life, where the book leads you on a fascinating and detailed journey through the seasons, where it grants you tools to understand the self, family, society, and civilization, then leads you onwards through the cycles of life, generational archetypes, turnings, history, especially American history, and then explores the generational archetypes and how a nation may brace for the crisis. This video series limits its scope to merely the key points. In episode 1, we will talk about the season and the Saeculum, a brief introduction to help you understand what the linear history taught in school could not carry through. In episode 2, we will examine the generations that help shape each period. In episode 3, we will explore the turnings in more depth and look at examples from both global and Anglo-American history. In episode 4, after the author's new book about specifically the fourth turning has been released, we will look at what you can do in the crisis. An appreciation for history is never more important than in times when a secular winter is forecast. In the fourth turning, we can expect to encounter personal and public choices akin to the harshest ever faced by ancestral generations. We would do well to learn from their experience, viewed through the prism of cyclical time. This will not come easily. It requires us to lend a new seasonal interpretations to our revered American dream. As Arthur Wing Pinero has written, the future is only the past again, entered through another gate. The next great gate in history is approaching. It's time to trust our instincts, think seasonally, and prepare. Forewarned is forearmed. There are 3 main ways of thinking about time: chaotic, cyclical, and linear. Chaotic was how ancient and traditional civilizations thought about time. They thought that time is like a chaotic timeline and events follow randomly, and assigning meaning is hopeless because change is beyond human control or understanding. This has now become rooted in different ideologies and religions, for example, in advocating for nirvana or nihilism. Remember when we talked about Waiting for Godot on this channel, where there seems to be no meaning in waiting and yet the characters continue to wait? Yeah, it's similar to that. There's no meaning to the timeline that events follow, so what's even the point to try and understand it? The issue with this time view, as great as it seems to have no sense of responsibility, is exactly that. In a society where there is no sense of cause, consequence, all goes. So in most societies, people tend to believe that we should be held accountable for our actions, and thus we move away from a chaotic timeline to a cyclical timeline. This timeline emerged when ancient civilizations began to examine the cycles of the seasons. Once they noticed those cycles repeat, so that a farmer may know when to plant crops or when to harvest and when to brace for a hungry and long winter. It wasn't only the seasons that the ancients chartered. It was things like planetary events, like lunar months, like zodiac signs. I mean, think to the Chinese zodiac sign or Lunar New Year. Cyclical time was the answer to conquering the chaos and tracking time through seeing the routine and through seeing the repetition. It's acknowledging that each circle has its beginning and its end. You can always make new circles and new cycles, and yes, this limits originality and creativity because nothing you've done will ever be new if every event is just a circle and a repetition of what has gone on before, but at the same time, it offers comfort. We've gotten through this before and we can get through this again, even if the terms and the players are different. Finally, linear time. Time as a story, what we have gotten used to in modern society. It may be hard to believe, but actually this concept of time caught on with the Protestant Reformation that spread knowledge beyond the clerical elite, that decided that knowledge shouldn't just be contained in the bishops and in the people who run the dioceses and the churches. It should be given to everyone. And then we had the Enlightenment movement and suddenly the Industrial Revolution. And with the Industrial Revolution, of course, society began running on steroids. Just like cyclical time conquered chaotic, so too did linear conquer cyclical. And it may be hard to believe that we once viewed everything in terms of cycles. I mean, of course we have this remaining evidence of like Lunar New Year and horoscopes in Asian culture, but you might ask, what about Western society? Well, actually, we might observe that Christmas, the core tradition that most Western communities celebrate, in a society that has a lot of Christians, it's a tradition that honors death and rebirth. When Christians tried to denounce classical cycles as something associated with paganism, the Reformation led to attacks on pagan holidays and the change of clocks, calendars, diaries. And since then, we've just continued to defy the cycles because look at me now, I'm in complete brightness and it's 9 p.m. I mean, compare this to the past where our ancestors used to go to bed as soon as the sun set and wake up as soon as the sun rose. We have been defying these cycles. With heating, we defeat winter. With light, we defeat darkness. With medicine, we defeat the rest recovery cycle. Before, people valued patience and ritual and parts of a whole because of the cycles. No, it's not different because of a liberal or a conservative culture or whatever political alignment you want. Perhaps it's because of the linear time frame we follow, because it's all about haste. In a linear timeline, we look only forward. We do not see the cycles of history before us. I mean, even the term hustle culture, just think about it. We see only the road ahead. That's why we're constantly hustling to get as much done as possible before we move on and the past fades into some distant thing that we can never get back. I mean, it's a never-ending treadmill of human progress and a constant run to get more things done, and today 3 is a far more important number than 4. 3 is a masculine symbol, a great triad, whereas before, in most cultures, the dominant number was 4 because it represented, in the great quaternities of seasons, directions, and elements, the 4th element always circles back to the others. But of course, linear time also brings the reality of an awareness that we have that limited time cut off from the idea of repeating or eternality or having longer time than we actually have. In a linear time frame, because you only consider your own path forward and you don't see all the cycles and the generations before you, you're the one in control of your fate. This is the idea of the American dream, and it consumes us, leaving us with no sense of collective myth. We are constantly restless and uneasy, feeling like we're no longer young, but at the same time eternally too young to somehow make decisions about our own fate. I mean, I get that. I'm thinking about which career pathway to follow, and all I can think about is how did time go by so fast, and yet at the same time I can't go back to that careless innocence and freedom of childhood because I've moved away within that linear pathway too far away for it to come back. We are rapidly aging, and when things go well, when you feel like you're on top of the world, it's not an issue. But when things go badly, the linear view can crack, exposing the horror of time as an unfamiliar void. For linearists, the future is often just a straight line guess based on the recent past, but they don't examine what has happened in the bend of the line, in the reversal. I mean, if time is a straight line, what use is it looking at non-existent bends? So, thus the predictions that linearists make are no longer accurate. Others embrace chaotic time and see history as just a bunch of unrelated details and footnotes in the textbook. The importance of history is being sidelined again and again. History is no longer a mandatory subject like before in Ivy League universities. It's no longer a core undergraduate course. Many don't know the most important dates, like the French Revolution. I mean, what does it matter if it was 1789 or 1795, right? And never mind that it triggered a whole lot of many world-changing events. I mean, as long as it's not in the curriculum, people just don't care. And suddenly, look at where we find ourselves, trapped between the chaos and the pride of the linearists and unsure of what to do and how to be, and the American dream is a false promise and Gatsby is dead. But there seems to be an alternative, the concept of the ancient circle. We need to understand as a society that without examining how often there is a historical recurrence, no one can meaningfully examine the past. Because what is the point of talking about empires being built or empires collapsing unless we consider that this has happened before? And it will happen again. It is these enduring, repeated events that help define us. Recall that time without many of the things we impose on it socially. In its physical essence, it's just an assumed regularity. The regularity of those weeks, months, years. Etymologically, the word time comes from the word tide. This is an ancient reference to the lunar cycle, and we still remember and recall this in expressions such as Yuletide or good tidings. What about the word period? That comes from orbit, as in planetary period, planetary orbit. What about annual? That's from the word annus, meaning circle. Year and hour come from Greek words meaning solar period. Months comes from moon. Without these cycles, what word would we use for time? You may say, but wait a minute, Polina, didn't you just say that we're conquering winter, we're conquering darkness, that we've begun to conquer our nature and social, and we're replacing them with technology and creating our own cycles? Yeah, potentially. Or we may just be modifying the cycle lengths or even substituting one cycle for another. When we dam a river or industrialize a society, we might eliminate the cycle of floods or wars. Then again, we might just ensure that the cycle is both less frequent and more devastating. In conclusion, there's a natural rhythm of life that the ancients followed, and the authors argue that we should today as well. There are two types of these natural rhythms. 1. The Saeculum, the century, the length of a human life, and 2. Genus or generations. It beats to the 4 cycles of human life in 20-year increments. The Saeculum lends history its underlying temporal beat. Generations and their 4 recurring archetypes create and perpetuate history's seasonal quality. Together, they explain how and why cycles occur. There's a very famous essay on time and history called the Dia Natale. Censorinus writes about how the Etruscans measured natural cycles. So the Etruscans were an ancient civilization. They lived in Italy, but they had Turkish roots, and basically they're famous for predicting the end of their civilization, and they created various rituals to measure their prophecy about when they thought that their civilization would end, and they wrote that the beginnings of the cycles are brought about among those who are born on the day on which a city or civilization is founded. The one who lives the longest completes, with the day of his death, the standard measure of the first Saeculum, and among those alive in the city on that day, the one who lives the longest completes the second Saeculum. We know very little about the Etruscans. They were a very, very ancient civilization. We don't know how they carried out their calculations because, of course, that's so hard to count. We don't know who was the first person to discover this. They considered the natural human life to be the span and the central unit of their shared history and the destiny of their civilization. The Saeculum helped them record history from the inside, how people lived and remembered, because when the last person who remembered an event died, then the memories would be wiped out and we'd have a new cycle be repeated over again. In the end, their 10 Saeculum prophecy proved eerily correct because they were buried in the advance of Rome during the reign of Augustus, almost 1 full millennium after the year 0. This is just one example of an ancient civilization relying on the concept of the Saeculum. The Romans too tracked their time and their rituals in a similar way. They had the Saecular Games, similar to the modern Olympics. They were held around once every 100 years, which gave almost every generation of Romans a chance to witness them at some point in their lives. Perhaps it was, if you were unlucky, just when you were a baby, or perhaps it was an elderhood, but mostly they would witness them. And by the 2nd century BC, that's how Roman historians would record time. They would describe great wars and new laws and other chronicles in terms of the Saecular Games. But why this number? Why 100 years? Is it to do with the beauty of the 00 or the convenient round number? Actually, most likely it was to do with the prominent 80 to 110 rhythm that beat strongly throughout Roman history. It appeared in Rome's eras of renewal and innovation, such as the struggle to found the Republic, the wars against the Gauls, the Great Samnite War, the invasion of Hannibal, the Gracchi reforms. When the Romans eventually vanished from history just like the Etruscans, the Saeculum did not, and millennium later, Renaissance philosophers recovered it again. Today, our modern version of the Saeculum are the major wars and the new balances of power that happen roughly every 100 years as well. This quaternity was one of the many wheels of time that were ritualized by our ancient ancestors. The shortest rounds were governed by the sun and the moon, the famous waxing and waning cycles. The intermediate ones were the circles of life, and the longest cycles were the period of creation and destruction, like the Mayan Picton. Whatever the length of a cycle, each cycle was represented by a circle, symbolizing the perfect and unbreakable recurrence. The circle as a symbol has long been significant. Many of our holidays have roots in the ancient rituals, and for example, spring festivals celebrate newness and fertility and creation, midsummer festivals honor rulers and keep away witches, and autumn festivals thank the earth, and winter marks the moments from death to rebirth. In ancient India, Hindus and Jainais describe this as a yantra or a chakra, a circle or a disc, and the Buddhists as a mandala, a wheel of law or life. For the ancient Chinese, it's the concept of Tai Chi. It's a circle, it's a disc, it's stability under all the change. For the Greek, it's the word cyclus, meaning cycle and circle. On the temple to Athena, there's the epigram, all human things are a circle. If you look at the US $1 bill, see an eye above a four-sided pyramid, and there's an inscription. It says, Anno et coeptis, God smiled on the creation. These are words borrowed from Virgil's praise of the Augustan Saeculum, and the inscription underneath is actually Novus Ordo Seclorum, or the New Order of the Centuries, and the Saeculum is even on the money, because keep your eye on the Saeculum and you'll keep your eye on the money. Two particular symbols of circular time are almost universal, and one of them is the snake in a circle that periodically renews itself by shedding skin, and it's supposedly immortal. Another symbol is the circle dance with which communities greet new seasons of life, or the human ring, like the wedding ring. It's a never-ending circle. It shows the unbreakable continuity of time, and the circle can be divided into phases, sometimes two, but most times four. Every extreme is defined, balanced, and necessitated by its opposite. As the day turned, light alternated with dark. As the year turned, hot and dry alternated with cold and wet. As the Saeculum, or its equivalent, turned, peace alternated with war. The ancient Chinese called this the reciprocal interaction of yin, passivity, and yang, aggression. The ancient Greeks called it the dynamic pulsation of philia, love and harmony, and nekos, strife and separation. The Jainists believed that time's wheel oscillates between utsarpani, ascending motion, and avasarpani, declining motion, literally up serpent and down serpent. The ancients believed that each cyclical extreme, mirroring the hopes and fears of the other, helps generate the other. The night longs for the day for night. In war, people yearn for relief from strife, leading to peace. In peace, people yearn to champion what they love, leading to war. Let's go back again to the reason why the number 4 was so important. The holy mandala of the Hindus was drawn into 4 parts, and the Pythagoreans valued the tetrad. When the ancients described the physical universe, they turned into a 4-fold division of directions. The quaternities of time, the 4-fold seasonality, the Romans 4 vigilia, the 4 phases of the moon, the 4 phases of life. The Persians believed that 12,000 years of earthly time were divided into 4 eras of 3,000. The ancient Greeks' myth told of 4 ages: the gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron. Like the two-phase time, four-phase time alternates between opposite events and includes transitional periods, eras of development. Like people said in ancient China, summer and spring is warmth, benevolence that provides growth, and winter and autumn are periods of strictness and severity. Time's circle moves not only from cold to hot to cold, but also from growth to maturity to decay to death. The circles don't move smoothly into the next, however. They have a sudden change. In the lunar cycle, this break occurs during the 3 nights of darkness. In the annual cycle, during the natural death of winter. In the social cycle, after the death of father or a ruin of a village, or by extension after the death of a king or ruin of a dynasty. In their great year cycle, the Hellenics called this discontinuity the ekpyrosis, when all things, even human souls, are destroyed in fire. Thus cleansed, nature and history can begin again. To welcome this change, today we have the gestures of emptying and filling, from Christmas to Mardi Gras to Lent. In the past, there were rituals of emptying called kenosis and filling, pleurosis. Time restarts with every cycle, but as society becomes more modern, there is one central cycle that we still can't modify: the circle of the natural human life. What the Etruscans defined and the Romans knew as the Saeculum, because this is the only cycle we still cannot alter. We still can't live forever, as much as Dorian Gray wanted to in as much as his portrait provided him the opportunity. The planetary rhythms of light, heat, and precipitation can be mutated or circumvented by modern technology and global markets. The political rhythms of dynastic change can be twisted or frozen by ideologies and nation states. The natural human life cycle and its seasons, by contrast, remain relatively invariant. In summary of the Wheel of Time, each cycle is represented by a circle, symbolizing perfect and unbreakable recurrence. Each circle is divided into phases, sometimes 2, nearly always 4. Each circle of time has a great moment of discontinuity. Each circle requires that time be restarted at the moment of each creation. Each circle is presumed to repeat itself in the same sequence over a period of similar length. We have looked at time, and we have looked at ancient civilizations, we have looked at what I like most, history, and hopefully I have interested you in the concept of Saeculum, but we will look at its most important applications like the generations and the turnings, which I briefly mentioned today, in the next episodes. I want to end this video with a brief overview to hint at the importance of the Saeculum's applications and also outline what to come. In his study of war, Wright noticed that war happens in approximately 50 years oscillations. His study was then corroborated by Arnold Toynbee in A Study of History, where he identified a cycle of war and peace. For example, look at Europe since the Renaissance. The overture began with the Italian Wars, the first cycle began with Philip's Wars, the second cycle began with the War of Spanish Succession, the third cycle began with the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and the fourth cycle began with World Wars I and II. Like the concept put forward by the Etruscans, the historian believed that it's because the old generations die out and we no longer have memories of the war, so instead we romanticize it and thus we renew the crisis. But you may say, Europe has experienced so many wars and the Middle East is, a constant zone of conflict, so what wars matter? Well, it's about the wars that end a century and plunge the world into a new order. These are the wars that come at the end of a crisis. These plunge us into a new cycle, into a new circle. The Greek root of the word crisis refers to a decisive or a separating moment. In disease, the crisis is when the doctors know whether the patient will perish or whether the patient will live. And in battle, this is a moment where the nation either triumphs or fails spectacularly. The crisis ends one Saeculum and launches the next. If we're talking about seasonality, this is the peak of winter. How would we consider the summer peak? Well, here is where the religious anthropologist Anthony Wallace put forward what he termed a revitalization moment. After the winter, the collective response is to make a new society, culture, personality. These are movements that are loaded with attack against the old order and are all put forward by young people, all set forward new values. All are separated from the prior revitalization moment, or as the authors term it, the awakening, by the approximate lengths of a Saeculum occurring roughly halfway between the neighboring crisis. Crisis, awakening, crisis. The peak of winter and summer, and in between we have the autumn and the spring. For example, look at this: the Protestant Reformation, the Puritan Awakening, the Pietist Awakening, the Evangelical Utopian Awakening, the New Age Awakening. In the second quarter of the Saeculum, the awakening, the summer to the winter, the confidence born of a growing security triggers an outburst of love that leads to disorder. In the fourth quarter, the anxiety born of a growing insecurity triggers an outburst of strife that reestablishes order. You can see this pattern best with America because it has one of the most stable rhythms, because it started fresh and new and rejected tradition and broke away from the British Empire. So it was born new and liberated, and because of that, it's a great social experiment for us to observe the rhythms and the cycles of history. But I will come back to this in more depth in the next episodes. I would like to do a brief introduction to what is a universal denominator of the human condition. The Chinese philosopher Lin Yutang once observed, "Human life almost reads like a poem. It has its own rhythm and beat, its internal cycles of growth and decay." The ancients saw this by portraying life as a circle, and nature and society split it into 4 parts. For native North American societies, it was the stages of childhood, youth, maturity, old age. For the Hindus, it was a journey through ashramas. For the Romans, it was through Puritia, Juventus Virilitas, and Senectus. In this video, we talked about the seasons of history and how they shape our life, and how the result of this is in fact different generations. There's a recurring cycle of 4 archetypes, and what determines the length of a phase of life for one archetype is not how long they live, but rather the dynamic of their life. We do more in life now, and the Saeculum has shortened from a century to roughly 80 to 85 years to match this. Season 1 is spring, childhood, growing and learning and ripening, ritualized in things like our first job or our first vote or our graduation. Season 2 is summer and young adult, the threshold of getting older and still being young. Season 3 is the autumn, the midlife, a little sunny and a little sad. And last comes season 4, the winter, life ending in elderhood, a time for leisure and a time for reflection. The first 4 childhoods through elderhood comprise the quaternity of the human life cycle. The combined length of these 4 phases, roughly 84 years, matches the span of the American Saeculum dating back to the Revolution. So you have seen that the Saeculum can be applied from anything to war, to culture, and to understand both our historical period and the people within it. Next episode, we will take a closer look at the generational archetypes specifically. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss a video. Hopefully you enjoyed this video because it was a little bit of something new. It was a dive away from my usual content into something a little bit more serious and historical and political and economic. So thank you so much for making it this far. And I'll see you soon.